afternoon. Welcome to today's meeting and report launch on weighing concerns and assurances about a nuclear deal with Iran prepared by the Iran Project. This is the fourth co-sponsored meeting with the Iran Project that the Woodson Center has hosted. Previous meetings included the Iran Project report on Iran and its neighbors, regional implication for U.S. policy of a nuclear agreement, which was in September 2014, strategic options for Iran, balancing pressure with diplomacy, April 2013, and weighing the benefits and costs of military action against Iran, September 2012. We are very happy to continue this collaboration with today's meeting, and don't think that if there is a deal, this will be the end of reports and meeting with the Iran Project. It will be a totally, hopefully, new beginning. Today's meeting is moderated by Ambassador Pickering, who will introduce the panelists. And we have also an overflow, so Tom will take also questions in writing from the overflow if they get them to you. Please, Johan.
I'm Bill Luers. I'm director of the Iran Project and have been under Holly's official guidance for many, many years. Thank you again to the Woodrow Wilson Center for being host to what we do. We've found this a very agreeable place, an increasingly important location to make public announcements on a bipartisan level. And so thank you for doing this, Holly. And also, I hope this isn't the end of this agreement because I'm out of a job if it is. You know, the Iran Project, I guess many of you know what we do, why we do it. It's been going on with some of us since 2012, in 2002, when I was getting there, Stephen. When we began this to see whether there was an opening, a possibility of having a diplomatic solution to our problems, particularly the nuclear problem with Iran. And it's been a long haul. And what's interesting is over the years, we started with about 7 or 8, and we still have about 7 or 8 of our core members. But the group has expanded significantly. Core group's still the same, but we have now 50 or 60 prominent former military officers, former members of the U.S. government security establishment, academics, all well-known, prominent, who now contribute to the drafting of our projects. Not only sign on to them, but tell us where we have to modify it. So this isn't a consensus document we get. We get a document that's been enriched by people with experience and knowledge so that we can make it as nonpartisan as possible. And this is trying even harder to deal with this difficult moment in U.S.-Iran relations. The core group are Tom Pickering, who's our senior statesman. And by the way, I point out that I'm senior to him, in age certainly.
And statesmanship.
And Jessica, who is our wise eye and probably the best writer we have, who keeps writing too much and doesn't do much time with us. And we've had a number of military officers joining us, and Jim Cartwright, General Cartwright, is one of our stars who contributed substantially to this report. And Gary Seymour, who is a late arrival at our table, but who has probably the best informed person here since he was involved in this Iran for the U.S. government for so many years. And well, Gary, welcome. Thank you for coming back. Then in addition to that, there's Stephen Heinz, who was our co-founder, supporter with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund funding. It's gone back now since 2001. I'm sure they spent over $1 million $2 million on what we've done together, and I thank you, Stephen. Jim Walsh, who got married, he is off on a honeymoon, and he worked on this project until just almost hours before his wedding. And we were getting emails, angry, funny, typically on target, from him till the very last minute. We haven't heard from him since. I don't know whether
It's a good sign.
and then Frank Wisner, the most elegant member of our group, is also just got married, and he's off traveling. And Paul Pillar, as that's the last. I also want to mention Iris. Where is Iris? Is she here? Oh, here's Iris, yeah. Who, and Joy Drucker, but Iris is as any of you know, the driver in this whole thing, and she's so important to making sure, I guess not the driver, she's the executor. She gets it done, yeah. And Joy is our colleague here in Washington, Joy Drucker, who helps us get to the Congress. Let me just conclude by saying, after doing all the work we've done over the years, and particularly this report, we believe that there are certain individuals out there on the Congress, throughout this country, throughout the world, who have such distrust, it's so deep for Iran, that there's no agreement anybody could negotiate that anybody would, that this group would think would not be violated by Iran. So that group, we're just going to have to wait and see whether this agreement will prove to be successful. There are risks in every agreement. There are risks in this agreement. And I guess we leave it to you to decide, are the risks that remain in this agreement, once we see it, overweigh the risks of the consequences of not reaching the agreement? And if you believe that there are fewer risks in passing up this agreement, what would be your alternative? And that's the question we leave you with. Tom, sorry it took so long to get where I am, okay?
Thank you, Bill. Very well introduced. And I'm, in the interests of saving your time, going to say just one or two things. First, welcome to all of you. It's great to have a rainy day in Washington. It brings out the non-proliferation gurus, the press, and everybody else who lack, with the absence of sunshine, anything useful to do. Secondly, if you're here expecting a long introduction of the speakers today, you're in the wrong place. You're not going to get it. If you don't know these people, maybe you shouldn't be here, but we're delighted to have you anyway. The speaking order today is going to be Gary, Jim, Jessica, and then I may have a few words to say at the end. Then we'll move to your questions and answers. When you're asking questions, just identify yourself as briefly as you can. We'd like to have the questions really be questions, not speeches or statements, and I will use my moderating role to interrupt if it clearly is apparent that the question has eluded you. Thank you again very much for being here, and thank you, Gary, for being here as well, and I'll turn the floor over to you, and then we'll go to Jim and Jessica. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Bill. So if you've had a chance to look at the briefing book, I think it does a very fair job of describing the concerns and the assurances of the emerging Iranian nuclear deal, and in particular, the way it deals with the physical limits on Iran's enrichment program, which is probably the most controversial one of the parameters of the agreement. And the fact is, both sides have made significant concessions to get this far in the negotiations. Despite the Supreme Leader's earlier red lines, he appears to be willing to accept a significant reduction in Iran's current enrichment capacity and a significant delay in achieving a much larger industrial scale capacity in exchange for sanctions relief. The U.S. has also made significant concessions. We started, our opening position was that Iran would be restricted to several hundred centrifuges for 20 to 25 years. Now we're prepared to accept several thousand centrifuges for 10 to 15 years. Now, of course, the critics argue that we could have gotten a better deal. Longer duration, fewer centrifuges, if we'd bargained tougher, or if we go back to sanctions to impose more economic pressure on Iran. But I don't know how to prove or disprove the counterfactual. And in fact, it really doesn't matter. The deal is what it is. Both sides are committed to getting an agreement, and I don't see any evidence that they're backing away from the essential parameters that they've already agreed to, and in particular, physical limits on Iran's nuclear program, its capacity to produce fissile material, as well as enhanced inspection measures. But of course, there are several very important issues that haven't been resolved yet. These include the exact timing and conditions for sanctions relief, the plan to build up Iran's enrichment program between year 10 and year 15. We know the physical limits begin to come off at year 10. They're completely removed at year 15, but it hasn't been resolved yet what will happen in that 5-year period. Another big issue is the resolution of the so-called possible military dimension investigation by the IAEA into Iran's past weaponization activities. And finally, the precise mechanism and procedures for challenge inspections and for enforcement in the event that Iran doesn't comply. I think these are critical issues. They're not marginal issues. I think they're very important in terms of how one weighs the final evaluation of the pros and cons of the agreement. Of these issues, in my view, the most important one is the mechanism for determining challenge inspections of suspect activities at undeclared sites, and what the enforcement process would be in the event that Iran refuses to accept such a challenge inspection. The reason why this issue is so important is because if Iran cheats, if they do, it's much more likely to involve clandestine enrichment activities where they might hope to avoid exposure than cheating at the declared sites, which are so heavily inspected that it would be quickly detected by the IAEA. The P5+1 proposal, as I understand it, is to set up a commission under a new UN Security Council resolution that would have the mandate to approve IAEA requests for inspections of suspect sites if the agency has reason to believe that there are prohibited nuclear activities taking place at that site. And then if Iran refuses to accept that inspection, if the commission approves it, then the UN Security Council sanctions would be automatically reimposed. I think there are a lot of details about the composition and the procedure of what the decision-making process would be on this commission. But if we're able to achieve what we're trying to achieve, which is a commission that would create a mechanism for authorizing challenge inspections and a snapback of sanctions without requiring a new UN Security Council resolution, this is as important, maybe even more important, than the physical limits on Iran's enrichment program, because, as I said, the risk of cheating by pursuing secret enrichment activities is much more likely and a much bigger danger than the risk of cheating at declared facilities. When I first heard about this proposal, I thought it was too good to be true. And I guess Supreme Leader Khamenei does too, because he's already started to raise questions about whether or not Iran is prepared to accept such a scheme. In particular, he's raised questions about whether military sites would be subject to inspection under this mechanism. He's also said publicly that sanctions relief has to begin immediately once the agreement is signed. And he said that Iranian nuclear scientists won't be subject to interviews as part of the efforts by the IAEA to investigate possible military dimensions. Now, we can speculate why Khamenei has raised these obstacles and issues. Maybe it's just the usual good bargaining tactics, and the Iranians are going to push until the very end to try to get as good a deal as they can. Maybe Khamenei wants to delay a deal in order to deny President Rouhani a political victory in the run-up to the April 2016 Majlis elections. Maybe Khamenei is setting the stage to blame Rouhani for making too many concessions. I don't think we can really know what's going on. In my view, I think both sides are too close to the finish line to turn back now. I think there's very strong political will to get an agreement. And I think all of the remaining issues are resolvable. Maybe not by June 30th, but I hope the administration feels comfortable taking some extra time in order to get these final agreements in place. And as I said, I think the resolution of these issues could tip the balance for or against a deal. We know that any agreement is going to trigger a political battle in Congress under the terms of the Corker-Cardin bill, and it could easily be decided by 1 or 2 votes. And in my view, a good outcome on these remaining issues could tilt the balance in favor of an agreement. So I think the administration has a lot at stake in continuing to stick to its positions and to try to get a good deal in these last months. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Jim?
I think, from my perspective, what I looked at was a military view of this activity and how a military person would look at this problem and figure out what the role of the military would be, a military intervention, et cetera. And so that's the perspective I come at this with, and in participating where I really laid my head. The first is that spilled milk is well behind us. Negotiations now are the only viable path to a solution. I mean, that is the essence of where we are today. Those negotiations have done a tremendous amount of good and value added to any military intervention that might be envisioned. Okay? We started with very little knowledge of what was going on. We started with a very little knowledge of what it was we were actually trying to prevent other than weaponization. Okay? Now we've got 3 clear objectives. The first is, maintaining some sort of control as defined in the agreement over a uranium fuel cycle that leads to a weaponization. The second is the same thing, only in a plutonium fuel cycle. And the third is the covert option. Those 3 things are essentially what we're focused on as objectives. Managing those 3 areas become the critical activities, both in the negotiations and to the extent that a military option would be necessary or envisioned, those are the areas that you would focus on. Breaking those chains in the first 2 cases, in the uranium fuel cycle or the plutonium fuel cycle, or breaking the chain that supports a covert option using one of those 2 cycles. We have learned so much from the negotiations. That issue now is no longer, I have 650,000 square miles in which to find a target. That's not the problem anymore. We're not in that position anymore. That's not an advocacy for a military solution. Absolutely not. It is not to say that a military solution has any way of solving this problem. It doesn't. This is not a military problem. So those are key. The second issue to me in this activity is that we must maintain either, some have called it the reasonable man approach, some have called it the moral high ground. We must maintain the ability to hold together the coalition of allies, okay? And that means that 1, we must negotiate in good faith. 2, we can't walk away from those negotiations without a clear violation on the part of the Iranians. That if the negotiations are successful and the Iranians violate, then in all of those cases, we must maintain the moral high ground of a reasonable man response to that activity. If we don't, then it becomes very difficult to hold these things together, particularly over any extended period of time. It becomes very difficult to manage and hold an alliance together. And the third point, and I'm a Marine, so all you get is 3 points, because I run out of fingers at that point, is if a military intervention is necessary, okay? And again, I repeat, a military intervention is not a solution. It is in support of a strategic objective, and that strategic objective are those 3 areas I looked at: plutonium fuel cycle, uranium fuel cycle, covert option. Then the military objectives in support of that strategic activity are tactical in nature, and they are designed or should be designed to reset the clock in whatever area is necessary. So if it's a uranium activity that we suspect there's a violation, you want to reset the clock in that area. You want to be precise enough to do that. And then the second activity that you want to accomplish with the military is to diminish the options that Iran has for retaliation after the strike, okay? And the key objective is compel them to return to the negotiations or to the agreement in compliance. And that's very clear now for the military side of this equation. Again, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that you must have that. And the negotiations have put us in a place where understanding that isn't perfect knowledge, but it is so much better than what we had in the past, that we're in a far better place today than we have been at any time.
Thank you, Jim, very much. Jessica?
My assignment is to back away from the technical or military aspects and talk about the broader issues involved in the negotiation, which both of my colleagues have done to some extent. But let me very quickly try to go through some of the arguments that are being made and some of what we see as the offsetting assurances related to them. The first is this deal is too weak because President Obama and Secretary Kerry have been too eager for a legacy. This is an argument that, first of all, of course, is hard to make since we don't have, for or against, since we don't have the agreement yet. But one piece that you can say is that the joint agreement from a year and a half ago, the interim agreement, turned out to be, although it was welcomed by critics at the beginning as criticized as having been much too weak, turned out actually, when looked at closely, to require an awful lot more give from the Iranians than from our side. So insofar as there is a score in this game so far, the score is very much on the side of the U.S. negotiators. of the P5+1 negotiators, who did get in the interim a deal that required much more giving up on the Iranian part than on the coalition side. A related argument is the walk-away argument that was first raised by Prime Minister Netanyahu and repeated by him this week, but by many, many others in Washington, which is you can get a better deal, walk away. They want it more than we do, call their bluff. These are all words that have been used. I think on close examination, this argument falls completely apart. The notion that after this much effort, a decision by the U.S., absent some Iranian violation that triggers it, to walk away from a process that has so far been, I would say, signally successful, would show a lack of good faith that would make it extremely unlikely, even without the uncertainties of Iranian politics, which are important, that they would ever come back to the table. And we know that they are quite close. Third point, which is related again, is the tendency to measure, in saying the deal is too weak, is to measure it against a negotiation with an enemy that had been defeated on the battlefield. This is not the situation the P5+1 negotiators are in. They're negotiating with a proud, strong nation that is hurting economically, but that has enormous resources and that has gotten itself to within weeks, months, a few months, of having one fissile materials worth of weapons fuel. So we are not negotiating with a defeated enemy. In terms of what happens after, and Holly said at the beginning, this is not an end if we get a deal, but a beginning, and that's so true. Our view is, those many people who've worked on this, is not to expect very much change in the short or midterm. There's a huge reservoir of distrust between our two countries. There are enormous number of areas of disagreement, and there are active wars going on which we are on different sides. But over the longer term, this does remove, if successful, a huge block, the biggest block, that prevents any work between our two countries on areas where our interests do converge. And they do to a degree in Iraq, to a significant degree in Afghanistan, on other issues like drugs. There are many issues where we might work together in both interests. In terms of implementation, and this has gotten far too little attention. Other negotiations, in particular the North Korean negotiation, have fallen apart on issues both in terms of too much vagueness and not enough detail in the agreement, on the one hand, and failures to implement on the other. So far, those who've been involved on both sides have been restricted to a tiny number of people. And that will have to be broadened rather quickly. And that raises the question of whether an interest section could be set up that would enormously facilitate work back and forth. Sanctions relief, as Gary said, is going to be the dance. You do this, we do that, you do this, we do that, is going to be a hugely difficult part of completing this agreement and of implementing it. I would say that the U.S. has a well-established weakness in getting rid of sanctions once they've succeeded. And I think everybody in this room could name half a dozen cases where that has been true, sometimes for decades. And we have a habit of moving the goalposts on what constitutes success. And so this will be a challenge for the United States. The offset there is that the economic leverage that we will gain from sanctions relief, if the agreement is implemented by the Iranians, should become, over time, significantly greater than the leverage that we get from sanctions. Finally, I think it is critical to remember that no matter what is agreed to, the capacity to reimpose sanctions and to enforce the will of the P5+1 will depend almost entirely on an international view of who is at fault in walking away from the agreement or in violating the agreement. And this may not be so clear. We never were able to work out with the North Koreans who violated the agreement first. You can make a case on either side. So this means a huge burden on the negotiators to reduce the areas of vagueness and lack of clarity in the agreement to the absolute minimum that they can do between now and the end of the month, on the one hand, and the U.S. capacity as a unified government to live up to its side of whatever is agreed to. This is a critical issue. So let me stop there and go to the questions.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to very briefly cover just three things that stick in my mind that might be useful to put on the table now. When do sanctions come off? I think that there are very clearly now established 4 compliance requirements on Iran before sanctions come off. One of those is to reduce the stockpile by 98% from 10,000 kilograms to 300 kilograms of 3.67 low enriched uranium. The second is to move roughly 14,000 centrifuges, partly out of Natanz, partly out of Fordow, and that's important. And I think a significant requirement. The third is to change the center of the Arak reactor so that it no longer produces a significant quantity of weapons-usable plutonium. And finally, to settle the question with the IAEA of the outstanding issues under the phrase possible military developments, which relates to past Iranian actions that are still subject to questions. Secondly, I think it is useful to note that with respect to a covert program, and I've been involved in arms control negotiations since 1960, the effort has been quite seriously to shift the risk to Iran as the potential violator and not to us on our side, the P5+1, as the people violated against, if I can put it that way. And that's being done through several methods. One, by IAEA inspections, the most extensive ever known and the broadest ever known, and they cover a wider degree of activities, not just those activities which directly produce fissile material, but the ancillary activities of centrifuge production, uranium mining and milling, the beginning of the ore cycle, and the whole question of the importation of any goods for the nuclear program are all subject to inspection. The second piece is that intelligence organizations around the world, the euphemism national technical means was used to describe this in U.S.-Soviet negotiations, will make available additional information that may come into their hands or which they will directly connect. That means that Iran has what is now a synergy of inspections to look at between domestic intelligence on our side and other sides, and the question of the international inspectors. And the international inspectors, through their work, through ability to talk to personalities, among other things, will enhance the uncertainty for Iran should it choose to break the agreement. But why, if Iran is dead set on making a nuclear weapon, would they have an agreement, the dangers for which breaking it are so severe, and up to including the use of force against them, that they would have ever entered this in the first place? Well, that's a question I leave for you to ponder, but I think it's an important question that's out there. And so Bill said initially, the risks here are very important, and it's very important to know where they rest. And so I leave now my short statement and open it up to yours. The floor is open for your questions. We'd be delighted to try to address them. And again, just a reminder to please identify yourself, if you would, for your question. And we welcome any questions from everybody. Thank you, please. Okay, we'll start right here with the lady, and you will move the microphone, and then we'll move around.
Thank you. My name is Meg Lundsager, and I'm a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center. My question for you relates to the lifting of sanctions. Let's suppose there's an agreement and it's moving along and the sanctions are being lifted. How confident are you that the private sector, whether the financial sector, the industrial sector, the energy investment side, will feel comfortable enough to go back and engage with Iranian counterparts and not fear the reimposition of sanctions or fear that they might, go beyond what they're supposed to do? And inadvertently, then you end up with the sanctions continuing even though they're not there in law. Thank you.
It will be a balance that will go from being very frightened to being pretty confident that will change over time. And it will be different between European private sector and the American private sector. European private sector, and I should say also some in the U.S. have already shown themselves to be very eager to get back in, and they will be balancing risk just like everybody else is balancing risk.
So just to add to that, I think you're quite right to raise the question of how much of an economic benefit Iran will get in the near term, because there will continue to be restrictions on American companies. We're only promising to waive the nuclear-related sanctions. We'll continue to have a tremendous layer of sanctions imposed against Iran for terrorism, human rights reasons, and so forth. So that will restrict what U.S. companies can do. And I think European banks in particular will be quite cautious because of money laundering concerns and so forth. Secondly, the oil market is going to make it difficult for Iran to really expand their customer base without some significant price cutting, since there's relatively weak demand and oversupply right now. So for all those reasons, I know some people are concerned that at least, and this is something Jessica mentioned, at least in the beginning, you might have some disgruntlement inside Iran that they're really not getting as much benefit as they thought they would in exchange for accepting constraints on their nuclear program. And that's been part of the complaint about the interim agreement inside Iran, that they've frozen most of their nuclear program and they haven't gotten very much benefit for it.
Let me just add one point in which I think the motto is the bad news is the good news. The bad news is that Iran has done what it thought it was necessary to do in its own vision around the world in terms of actions that we consider, and I certainly would consider, to be both illegal and disruptive. And I haven't seen anybody been able to make the case that they have been vastly restricted, either there or in their nuclear program, from a lack of cash. And I suspect that they will prioritize that particular set of issues. So the notion that with sanctions off and the flow of funds back into the Iranian system, this will produce a new terrible wave of awful misbehavior, in my view, is a not proven Scotch verdict.
There was a gentleman here.
Yes, sir, right down here.
I'm Gareth Porter, independent journalist. I have a question for Gary Seymour. You've been quoted many times, of course, as saying what you said today, that the likelihood of Iran having a sneak-out approach rather than trying to accumulate the necessary enriched uranium for a bomb through their declared facilities is the primary problem. But you told David Sanger, quotes you in his book, as saying when you were still in the government, that if they should try a sneak out, we're quite confident, if I remember the exact wording, that we will be able to detect them. So I'd like to ask you to explain whether, first of all, whether you in fact think that there is a serious possibility of escaping detection. If so, why?
So let's just be clear that I'm talking about the construction of a clandestine facility to produce fissile material. I'm not talking about clandestine weaponization research and development, which I think is extraordinarily difficult to detect, either through inspection or through U.S. or other intelligence means. But for the construction of a clandestine facility to produce fissile material, like Natanz or Fordow, the U.S. has demonstrated, U.S. and U.S. allies have demonstrated a very strong capacity to detect those facilities while they were under construction and before they were completed. I think that that continues to be the case, but obviously one can't take it for granted. I mean, the game of intelligence is always both improving intelligence and improving counterintelligence and trying to stay one step ahead of the other side. So in my view, even without an agreement, we have a reasonably strong capacity to detect construction of a clandestine enrichment facility. I would argue that if the agreement contains the additional inspection measures that Tom talked about, both additional IAEA inspection as well as this special mechanism for challenge inspections, that would enhance even more the likelihood that we would be able to detect clandestine activity, and therefore, one would think, make it less likely that Iran would risk pursuing those activities for fear that it would be exposed. But of course, we can't get inside the head of the Iranians and know how they make the calculation of what they can get away with. I mean, that's impossible. They may make a misjudgment and think they can get away with something they can't. The best we can do is make sure we have strong intelligence, work with our allies who have strong intelligence, and then set up an international mechanism of inspections that will enhance our intelligence and work in a synergistic way.
Down here, please.
Eleanor Bachrach. I've worked on Capitol Hill and also for USAID more in several countries. My question has to do with the Congress, and there's likely to be, I think, a big fight, a lot of political posturing. The whole business of Netanyahu's speech, it's hard for me to think that he really feels there could be a better deal. He wants no deal. Do you think this is likely to have a harmful effect, or will it make Iran feel that we've given up a sufficient amount to make it palatable?
Well, the negotiations will be finished before Congress begins its debate. So the deal will be what has been achieved by then. You know, unfortunately, this issue is now tangled up in the Republican primary process, and that's unavoidable and very unfortunate. But the critical issue will be, can everybody stay focused on the question of what are the realistic alternatives? That's the core issue. Everything else just pales by comparison. And we will see whether we can have a more focused and intelligent debate than we've had so far.
So let me just try to add to that. I mean, there are lots of different scenarios, but we know that under current legislation, Congress has set up a mechanism to review the agreement and to have an opportunity to vote on it. I think it's quite likely that Congress will vote by majority either to disapprove the agreement or to approve it with killer conditions, like Iran must accept Israel as a Jewish state. That means the president will veto that resolution, and then the question will be whether there'll be 2/3 vote in both chambers to override the president's veto. I think it's going to be a very close vote. I think it's going to come down to a handful of senators and congressmen either way, which is why I'm emphasizing that the remaining details could easily, be determinative in terms of giving either potential supporters a good reason to vote to sustain the agreement or giving the opposition much stronger argument for opposing it. And so just to repeat myself one more time, I think these last remaining issues are not just marginal technical details for the nuclear geeks. I think they have important political ramifications.
Way in the back on the side here.
My name is Al Sharif Nassif, and I've been doing some grassroots consensus building in my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, talking to thousands of people about this issue in my spare time, just going around in the interest of peace and building mutual trust on sort of a local level. And I'm going to talk to my congressman later today, but what I wanted to ask from y'all experts is, what realistically needs to be done by Congress to implement this deal? I mean, what has to happen congressionally in order for this agreement to go through? Thank you.
Who wants to pick that up?
Well, let's assume the deal is completed and it is approved either directly by Congress or by failing to override a veto. The next step will have to be, and this is crucial, what I was talking about before on implementation, that the U.S. upholds what it has said it will uphold with respect to the timing of the relief of sanctions. And that will require, some of it the president can waive, but others are legislative and will require congressional action. So the negotiators have an enormous burden as I said, is to reduce any mushy areas, of any lack of clarity. The North Korean deal was 4 pages long, and it assumed that we were going to normalize relations. It was vastly broader than this very narrow, focused thing, and this is going to be detailed but Congress is going to have to be prepared to live up to what we agree to as a nation. And that will have consequences far beyond Iran if we fail to do it.
I think technically, too, the Congress will be asked in the 30-day period it has whether it wants to approve or disapprove the agreement. They don't have to do either. They can be stymied, as Gary said, on the question of veto. There will follow a UN Security Council resolution from the agreement. The Congress may want to see that. That will be important. The Congress will sooner or later have to consider the question of whether it wishes to support an IAEA that will be undertaking tremendous additional responsibilities. We will want to look, I think, wisely, as we have in the past, at our own safeguard program internally. What do the military need, if anything? What do we need in the way of bolstering U.S. Intelligence capacities? What's out there in that set of relationships? Is it possible and is it wise for us to consider whether, as Jessica said, an interest section in Iran as to complement the Iranian interest section of the United States and some beefing up of both may not make a useful addition? Should we think about additional communications capacities between the two countries, directly or indirectly? Those are important questions. They're addressed, at least some of them, directly and indirectly in the report. And I'm sorry, I think we thought you had the report. The report will be available to you as you leave. I apologize to you for not having it available to you before you came in, but I think you will find that the report is reinforced by what we have to say and vice versa. I'm now going to take 3 questions at a time, so that make them, as you can, cogently brief. And let me start back in the right-hand corner and then come along here and pick up 2 others.
Kevin Jones, the Aspen Institute. I hope the panel could please address the consequences of the potential deal, intended or otherwise, in the GCC and Gulf region, particularly after Saudi comments that they plan to match proliferation framework coming from Iran.
Next question, please. Anybody else? Right down here in the front. Andrew, thank you.
Andrew Pierre. Gary, Tom, Jessica have all mentioned and stressed the importance of the next steps of the next phase and the complexity of it and the way in which it could go wrong in the coming weeks and months. Now, I'm a little worried about our capacity to bring this off in that I believe that Wendy Sherman, and this has been negotiated by very small groups of people, a very important point, I think, in both the United States and the P5+1 and the Iranians. But that group seems to be changing, or potentially changing a bit. I think I'm correct in having read that Wendy Sherman has said she's going to be leaving sometime soon. We wish Secretary Kerry the best, but he's not going to be in the best position. On the Iranian side, which is less dependent upon X-rays maybe, we don't quite know what's going on there, but we wouldn't be too surprised if there was a political change within the Iranian government as allowed by the Ayatollah. So what is to be said regarding what potentially precarious nature of the negotiations at this time in terms of moving beyond a kind of a core group which has done so well over so long?
Okay, we're going to take one more question. President Tom, I think there was a gentleman right behind the last questioner who had a question. Maybe the question has been covered. If not, Hala? Hala is going to ask a question.
This is a question addressed to the general. The Iranians have been asked to open their military site, and so far they have refused. Is it common to go to countries and ask them to open their military sites to inspection? No, really, it's not a facetious thing. From a military point of view, you as a general. Thank you.
Jim, why don't you start? We'll just run along.
You can go back to our long history of arms control, and we have opened up military sites, found protocols, regimes by which to do that. The question is, what are those regimes and protocols, and negotiating them so that there is an element of the country to feel that it can protect its sovereign interests. And that you don't want to take that away, but you do want to take away the things that were prohibited in the agreement between the two countries. And so this will be just like the other things. It will be a more detailed negotiation about access and how to request it, how to then get it, and then how to either be denied that access or not. And that's part of what has to get negotiated here in the closing. But access to military sites, I think, is probably something that's going to be important, not so much because of what the conventional military could do there, but the potential of what other activities could occur on a military site, since they tend to be large, or some of them tend to be very large.
Jessica, do you want to pick up on any of the questions?
GCC, the Gulf states are understandably very nervous. So much so that sometimes it's hard to distinguish whether they are more frightened of a nuclear Iran or a nuclear deal. But, you know, there has been 30 years, it's almost 35 years, of a frozen relationship between the U.S. and Iran that has in some sense, defined the region, in which the region is now defined heavily in sectarian terms. So the fear is that this will shift the weight of the United States drastically in favor of the Shia side. Our job, the United States' job, is to walk an incredibly difficult line with a policy that pursues national interests without taking that side one way or the other, Sunni or Shia. But the other part of it that I think has been that has been overdone has been the sense that somehow the United States, on doing this, would suddenly throw away these other issues that we have imposed sanctions over, concerns about terrorism, concerns about Iranian behavior in several different countries, concerned about human rights, throw them away and wrap our arms suddenly around Iran in a big, it's all of a sudden. It's come out even already that people say they've seen the signs of this terrible shift in the fact that the U.S. is not intervening in Yemen. Well, we're not intervening in Yemen for reasons that have nothing to do with Iran, and not because Iran is backing the Houthis. So we will have a job of assuaging GCC, understandable and well-based GCC nervousness and anxiety as this deal is finished. One other very quick thing, which is, the argument that somehow this deal will lead Saudi Arabia in particular and other GCC states to say, well, we want the same deal, in effect. If they're going to have a blessed enrichment program, we want one too. Well, this is probably the weakest argument against the deal that there is. I mean, if they haven't taken action to offset an unsecured Iranian program over 18 years, why would they suddenly do so in response to one with a program that is now crawling with international inspection? It's just not, I think, a strong argument.
Gary?
So just very quickly, first I want to reinforce General Cartwright's point that we have a lot of experience knowing how to inspect military facilities to verify compliance without compromising military secrets. And I suspect at the end of the day, some kind of managed access arrangement will be worked out with Iran, because we obviously can't accept an agreement that specifically excludes, military sites from inspection. So I think the Iranians, when they lay out a position that's so absolute, that's just normal bargaining tactics, and at the end of the day, they'll figure out a way to include military sites, but with some protections for legitimate secrets that have nothing to do with the nuclear agreement. To respond to Andrew, I mean, I think that, Secretary Kerry's bike accident may very well complicate the end game in these negotiations, especially if he can't travel. We don't know that yet, of course, but that could be a problem, although they can move the venue to New York, and I assume it's easier for him to get to New. Well, I don't think the Iranians can do Washington because they don't have a secure communications facility. They need to have some place where they can write their cables back home, and the closest place to Boston is New York. So you could imagine that if Secretary Kerry can't travel, they could just move the venue to New York and carry out the negotiations there. Finally, on this regional question, which I think is very important, it's important to remember that the Middle East has always been a hotbed for pressure to produce nuclear weapons. And I think that's inherent in the nature of the region, of the conflict and tensions in the region. So in addition to Israel and Iran, you have 4 Arab countries have sought nuclear weapons: Egypt under Nasser, Iraq under Saddam, Syria under Assad, Libya under Gaddafi. They've all failed for different reasons. But that pressure for nuclear proliferation, I think, is going to continue, with or without a deal, because it's just part of the way politics is conducted in the region. But I think Jessica's right that the that in the absence of an agreement, the pressure on Saudi Arabia or others to try to pursue a nuclear weapons program would be greater than if there is a deal that constrains Iran's program. I don't think that's going to take away the motivation for some people in Saudi or Egypt or Turkey. But the big question for those countries will be, where are they going to get the external assistance to pursue a fuel cycle program? Nuclear suppliers are happy to provide them with power reactors, as we've already seen in the case of UAE and in Turkey, and I think we're likely to see other power reactor sales. But none of the major nuclear suppliers will sell fuel cycle to the Middle East, safeguarded or not. So the question will be really Pakistan and North Korea are the two cases you have to look at to see whether there's any clandestine transfers of technology. Of course, Pakistan already has a very long track record of transferring centrifuge technology to North Korea, to Libya, to Iran. Current Pakistani government says they won't do it. I think we're going to have to monitor and see whether or not they live up to those commitments. And North Korea is an even more difficult case. But since the Syrian transfer, they haven't engaged in any external nuclear cooperation. But it's an issue we're just going to have to keep an eye on.
Just to add to what Gary has just said and what Jessica said, very senior Saudis have said to me they would be satisfied to invest in international enrichment offshore as a way of dealing with their need to have, quote, the same deal. And I think that's very constructive and useful, and I hope indeed that that's the case, and I would, as Jessica said, not lose a lot of sleep at night on this one. I also think Andrew's question about the sufficiency of U.S. personnel resources and their availabilities is a real and interesting question. You have to remember that Bill Burns and Jake Sullivan are still connected with this, and despite the fact that they're part-timers, that we have a number of, I think, clear deep benched expertise in the negotiations, despite the numbers are few. That's been traditional with arms control negotiations. Understand Undersecretary Sherman wants to stay until the deal is signed, and that's useful. So I think that while it's a potential problem, I think it's, as Gary said, clearly a resolvable potential problem rather than an impossible one. I'm going to take 3 more questions, if there are 3 out there, and then we'll wind up, if I can, please. And so there's a gentleman down here, and then there's a gentleman in the mid-range. If you kind of keep us in mind for the next question, and then I'll find somebody amongst you for the 3rd question.
Hi, Howard LaFranchi with the Christian Science Monitor. Just quickly on the question of the Security Council resolution that might be required. Obviously, given the makeup of the negotiating group, P5+1, one would assume, well, there wouldn't be any problems there. But do you foresee any hitches, anything that when it got to that point might kind of hold things up?
Well, I've always...
Gary, let's do the next
yes,
2 questions. Okay. And the gentleman back there that I asked to keep his hand up, please, could you raise your hand? And then there's another gentleman here who's raising 2 fingers. So.
There are 4 Americans that are being held in Iran, 3 in prison, 1 Mr. Levinson, that nobody knows where he is in Iran. While you have some leverage with the nuclear negotiations, could they be used to free those Americans?
Next question, please.
Jim Loeb, IPS. To Ambassador Pickering, you listed the 4 points that would lead to lifting of sanctions. On the 4th, that is clearing up the PMD issue. The IAEA has said that would take some considerable time. And I'm wondering, are you referring to phased relief, or are you talking to about initial relief? Could you clarify that?
Yeah, I'll answer that right away. I've been told that IAEA has to be satisfied. I think that questions about predictions of time are uncertain here. There are Iranians who tell me that they can do all of this very quickly. We'll wait and see. As I heard the requirements defined, they're fairly difficult and fairly complicated. Let me just, on the Security Council, where I've had a little bit of experience, point out that the Security Council is master of its own fate. The P5+1 are obviously dispositive because if one of them disagrees, it won't happen. The idea is to have, as I understand it, a resolution which puts into effect the agreement and does a number of other things, including contains within it the arrangements for the automatic reimposition of prior UN sanctions resolutions if, in fact, a dispute remains unresolved coming out of the commission that is supposed to look at the question of differences of view about access. The parties, including the Russians and the Chinese, will all have the right of veto over this resolution. But this resolution could conceivably be framed in a way that, having had that right and not exercised it, they would not have a subsequent right of veto over the automaticity in operation of that resolution should there be a dispute. And we'll wait and see. This is new and unusual ground for the United Nations, but since there are no rules that confine the Security Council except the UN Charter, and that's very liberal, it's likely, in my view, to be workable. Gary, you wanted to make some comment on that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I've always been concerned that the Russians would not accept the mechanism that we're seeking, that would, as Tom said, that would automatically reimpose sanctions if the Commission finds noncompliance. But apparently that is not the case so far. So far as I understand it, the Russians and the Chinese are supporting a joint P5+1 proposal, and the issue now is whether the Iranians will accept that. I think the U.S. negotiators believe that during the course of the negotiations, the Iranians have accepted in principle that such a mechanism would be set up, but now they're into the really difficult work of putting it in writing, because it'll have to be codified in a UN Security Council resolution, and that's what's actually being negotiated, as one of the important issues that remains to be resolved.
With respect to the Americans who are being held in Iran, who are missing but presumed to be being held in Iran, I have every sense that before, during, and after this negotiation, this is a major subject on the minds of the American negotiators, and they've done everything that I think they possibly can. There are on the minds of Iranian negotiators certain Iranians who have been, in my view, duly and carefully convicted in the U.S. judicial system for various breaches of U.S. law that the Iranians would like back. This presents the usual conundrum, and I have no answer to it, and I think the administration would be wise to keep very quiet about it. I will say, however, that both sides seemingly have scrupulously avoided adding to the conditionality of the negotiations, the Americans and the P5+1, because they believe, in fact, that they will get a better nuclear deal if they do not have to pay for prisoners, if I could put it that way, and that's difficult. And it has a humanitarian aspect which is hard to swallow, but I think it ought to be looked at in that sense. The Iranians, because they don't want to slow down sanctions relief by having to haggle over other issues that might be introduced into the negotiations that they would see as seek favorable responses from the other side in their own interest. And I think that's been kept now for about a year and a half and seems to be the basic way in which these negotiations are proceeding. Jessica, any comments?
Well, I think it's worth reminding ourselves in that context that we tend to forget much too easily that Iran has politics, because we think of it as a dictatorship, when in fact it has an incredibly layered, almost Byzantine political system where politics is very alive. And I guess Gary mentioned the upcoming elections, but the importance of this, I think, in the aftermath of an agreement will be that the Iranians will be spinning their narrative of what they got. And we will be spinning our narrative of what we got. And both of those are meant for domestic audiences. And the danger will be if people start listening too much to the other guy's spin to his domestic audience, and then we immediately get all caught up in saying, oh my God, the Supreme Leader said yesterday thus and so, and therefore this whole thing is at risk. They presumably, I think it would be sensible to expect that there will be some moves in the short term after an agreement to do something that makes their conservative wing feel better. And those things we're not going to like. You know, that's a part of it. The other reason, I mean, the other issue on which is the one Andrew raised, which I think it's worth just saying, that this reminds us of the enormous weakness of our system, where we virtually cannot appoint and confirm senior members of administration for 18 months before an election. And this is a perfect example of when you might desperately need. I mean, you've got people who've been working for 6-7 years, who are tired, who need to see their children, who want to leave, and you can't do anything but play musical chairs with people who are already inside. This is a serious weakness of our system that has to get fixed at some point.
Thank you, Jessica. Jim, final word?
No, I think the thing that worries me probably the most is the narratives, and misinterpreting the narratives and going to the extremes in the narratives to find fact, and then using that as an argument why the agreement isn't working. And so we have to be careful there. We have to acknowledge that we have two political systems, the Iranian and ours in our case, that are going to play in this, and that they're going to spin it to extremes. And we have to make sure that we can, in this last part, start to bring those back together to a closer middle.
Thank you, Jim. I have two things I'd like to do. I have a question from the overflow room, and in the nature of fairness, want to deal with the question, but I'd like to deal with it myself because I think it has certain misinterpretations incorporated in it. The question is, given that the U.S. is currently violating agreements with Russia made during the Cuban Missile Crisis not to keep nuclear weapons in Turkey or other places near the Russian borders, there's a mix-up there. I don't think the Turkey thing had anything to do except for delivery vehicles. And the question of weapons on borders has another context, and hopefully the writer would go back and read the literature. And given that the U.S. is funding Israel's nuclear program when Israel is not a signatory to any non-proliferation treaty, why should the Iranians trust us as a negotiating partner? Well, I have to tell you, we're not funding Israel's nuclear program. We are funding Israel. And so I suppose one can make the conclusion that we've taken some of the pressure off their budget, whatever that might mean. And I don't argue with that. The question, of course, Iranians trusting us, they have a whole litany of issues, which if we had an hour, we could sit down and go over. And so mistrust and misunderstanding, unfortunately, are what I would call the leaden coin of the realm. Right. That we have to deal with, and that's unfortunate. And our hope is this agreement can advance the question of trust and understanding rather than the other way around. Now, before I end, I want to thank Plowshares and Joe Cirincione, who is a major, major supporter of us. And Joe, I see you in the back, and raise your hand and take a round of applause. We appreciate it very, very much. But I also want to thank Stephen Heinz and his continued support, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund's continued support. And I have to tell you, we would not be here today without the perseverance, the deep commitment, and indeed the fabulous herding instinct of Bill Luers. Bill has been, in every sense, the person who has made the Iran project move from the deep, dark days of 2001 till the days of the present, and he will never let us forget our obligations to him. Bill is our employer. We work for free, but we do it willingly because we agree with Bill and his leadership that this is an important and indeed perhaps one of the most important agreements of the 21st century so far, for our country, for the world, for the region, and our ability to try to get clarity, honesty, and straightforwardness in respect of support of this agreement and what it does and what it doesn't do are very significant, and Bill has had the inspiration and the perspiration to get us here. So thank you, Bill. Thank you, and thank you for your brief.
Great job, everybody.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yes, of course.